Howdy, Jackson. All right. I like it. But just for good measure, howdy, Jackson. Well, there are a few of you straggling. I appreciate the enthusiasm and the small but mightiness, but there are a few of you straggling. How you doing, Jackson? Jackson, there are a couple of things to know ahead of time. We are jazz musicians. And what that means is we thrive off of the energy that you give us. And so, if you hear something you like, you have options, things you can do about it. One of which you've already done, and that sounds like... Right. Some of you are clapping. If you're very old school and you stomp your feet, that's okay with us too. We appreciate that. To let you know who you're listening to tonight, the wonderful Joel Frahm on saxophone, Christian Burgs on the drums, Jack Aylor on the bass, Alex Murphy on the keys. My name is Roland Barber. Thank you very much. Out of curiosity, anybody's first jazz concert? Okay. All right, awesome. Anybody been listening to jazz for more than 30 years? More than 40 years? More than 50 years? I love this audience already. We're going to bottle you guys up and take you with us on the road this weekend. We'll get started with one that you veteran jazz listeners might recognize. Thank you. The name of that tune was?
Bye Bye Blackbird.
All right. I'm going to put Jackson in my pocket and carry him with me. I hope you can tell we're having fun up here. Ideally, that's what you observe at every jazz concert. Ideally. That was particularly fun because that's a tune that the five of us have never played together. And I was thinking, what would be a good sort of tune to break the ice? This, I played with all these musicians on stage in some capacity, but this weekend is our first time, playing as a unit together. Thank you. Sometimes the best thing you can do as a band leader is call the right people. And so I'm thoroughly excited and happy to be playing with these gentlemen. We're going to continue with another tune that you familiar jazz listeners may recognize. That first tune belongs to a special category of music. Music written for shows, movies, and theater, starting about the 30s, really going on till the tail end of the 60s. And we call that category of music the Great
American Songbook.
The Great American Songbook, which jazz musicians have turned to for inspiration and tunes for years. This next tune is not from that category. Jazz musicians have, I was going to say always, I'm going to stick by that, always kind of written music that also sees the world their own way. And this next tune comes from the pen originally of the great Wayne Shorter. And it, well, think about it. We'll talk about the time afterwards. What does it bring to mind? That's my question. It has a catchy title that people always remember, and the title stands out, but I never find myself thinking about the title when I hear the tune. So I want you to hear the tune first. Think about what your title would be. I'll take suggestions, and then we'll correct Wayne Shorter on the title of his own tune. That's a joke, yo. So what you got for a title for that? Footprints. Yeah, that's Wayne Shorter's tune, Footprints. We're going to continue with a tune that is much less serious in inspiration. Well, looking at the audience, and I was going to say, we all have like TikTok and stuff on our phones, and then I was like, some of us have TikTok and stuff on our phones. Congratulations if you don't. I'm trying to get rid of all that stuff now. But occasionally, the universe sends you funny videos you didn't ask to see. And those of you who know me personally in my walk of faith know exactly what I don't mean when I say the universe. But the universe sends you videos that you didn't ask to see. But every now and then one of them is funny. And about a year ago, there was a video of a dog who was downcast, and he was being chided by his owner because apparently he had a chance to visit some of the other dogs in the neighborhood and pursued some relationships that wound up with some unplanned families happening. And the owner saying to the dog, did you go to the neighbor's dog? Did you go visit the neighbor's dog? And the dog there's a voiceover narration for the dog. And he's going, no, I didn't do that. I didn't do that. Wait, I can't do that? I can't do that? And towards the end, they're like, no, you can't do that. And he's like, oh, okay, yes, I can. And the yes, I can just, to me, it's the punchline that you didn't see coming, that you needed. And that owner, it just tells the owner that whatever time you gave this conversation was not worth it. You know. And maybe you know someone like that. Let's hope not. But I couldn't shake laughing at that dog saying, yes, I can, for a couple of days. So I wrote a tune about it, and the tune is entitled, Yes, I Can. How many dog owners we got out there? Let me ask you dog owners a question. Are dogs happy? All right. Those of you who said yes, let me ask the same question. And speak up just as loud. Are dogs smart?
Sometimes.
Right. There's a great secret in that. We're going to continue with a tune, another tune of mine, an original tune. This one I wrote back in my college days. And it's funny, it stays around. It kind of goes through seasons and means different things at different times. At the time that I wrote it, how many of us just, I hate to do round of applause, but by solitary clap. Somewhere between 18 and 22, you had your heart, like, broken seriously. Okay, word. I'm not, see, I wasn't the only one. I should ask the fellas, maybe some of you knew her, but anyway. But yeah, around that time, I went through a season of heartbreak, and I thought, man, I don't know if this is worth it. I'm not sure I'm gonna do this again. And gave it some thought. Fortunately, there's a happy end to that story, and we'll get there in a couple of tunes. But this song hangs on that question. I just feel like with eyes closed, and again a solitary clap. Anybody ever thought, I don't know if I'm gonna try that again? Okay, all right. This tune hangs on that question, going, So this tune is entitled Learning to Love. In a lot of ways, you kind of have to go back, rebuild from the ground up, figure a lot of things out, figure yourself out, and then figure out that you ideally don't have to figure out the other person. All right, learning to love. there's the cliffhanger. Here's the big reveal. That was college. College came and went. Silly Little Gal showed up a couple more times, but eventually faded from the picture. Making way for me to go out dancing in Nashville, Tennessee. I started playing Latin music when I was in college. And I learned how to salsa dance, which has been a great joy in my life. And I happened to go out to a little club in Nashville, Tennessee that has a different name now. It's called Diamante, but it used to be called Ibiza. And walked in one night, saw this little chocolate lady dancing. And I said, nah, that's, I know that girl. That girl, she's too pretty to talk to me. And side note, a friend of mine said once, I was she heard me tell this story, and she said, what guy thinks like that? Like a girl's too pretty to talk to them? By solitary clap, fellas only. If you've ever thought, no, she's too pretty to talk to me. Yeah, my man got the right at it. He's like, I'm sitting next to her now. Yeah, it's by solitary clap, gentlemen. Okay, right. Right, my friend was like, who thinks like something's wrong with me? It's like, no, I understand aesthetic beauty. I'm a musician, and I own mirrors. So it's like, you know, I'd have to be a nice, really nice guy. You know, because just on the sheer aesthetics of it, I looked at this girl and said, no, I know, I recognize that. That's like, she was like, hey, how are you? Okay, well, it was nice meeting you. Like, and so I asked her to dance. Actually, I asked a mutual friend. I said, yo, who's that? Who's this girl? Come to find out, she had gone to her mutual friend and said, yo, who's that dude? And we got out there dancing, and I commenced my 10-question interview. Where you from? Where'd you grow up? Where you go to church? And she said, this dude asking me about church in the middle of salsa club at midnight on a Saturday night? Yeah. Yep, because at that point I kind of figured some things out. And long story short, that lady and I who met dancing salsa at a dance club in Nashville, Tennessee are coming up on 2 years married in September. And she's here, she's floating around somewhere. You'll see her floating around. She's figured out that she married into tour manager, photographer, administrative point, you know, all these other stuff. But she's thrilled to do it. So these next two tunes have to do with that. One, a familiar tune in a different dress than you're used to seeing it in. This is a tune by the wonderful Duke Ellington. You know part of it. Go ahead and join us for the part that you know. It's okay. We dig that. And then we'll follow that up with a different tune. I'll discuss that later. We've reached the crowd participation moment in the night. Right. We have two more songs for you. One is one will be complete fun. We're not going to worry about that one. But first, we either play an original or we play a standard. And I'm going to defer, if you've been listening to jazz more than 20 years, you get a vote. Sorry to our newbies. So for my seasoned jazz listeners, original original or standard?
Standard.
Oh, no. By solitary clap, in favor of a standard, in favor of an original. All right, we got you, Jackson. We get it. We'll start with the original. This comes out of a collection of music that I started probably 4 or 5 years ago. There's a sound that identifies the blues and music that comes from it. And that sound we loosely call the blues scale. Without F sharp, Alex, if you play the blues scale in the key of C without the F sharp. That's the sound. That's the sound that identifies like R&B from pop, because you don't hear that in Taylor Swift, but you hear it in Beyonce. I'm not saying anything bad about Beyonce or Taylor Swift, but I wanted to write a set of music that focused on that sound, because when I started looking into my personal history, I could find that sound going back and back and back and back and back and back, and I'm going, man, where does this sound come from? And it's interesting because that sound, a lot of the music in the early history of jazz does deal with the fusion of sounds that happened uniquely here on American soil. But the blues is not an African music. The blues, that sound of the blues that has the wail and hurt, but there's something uplifting in the expression of that. I think for both us musicians and for the listener, there's a commonality and a shared soul in that sound. And so I wanted to write music that featured that sound, and I probably wrote like 16 tunes. 2 or 3 of them really stuck around, and one of them has sort of made its way to the top of the list. And it gets its title from, I'll tell you, the title is N-A-S-H-I, Nashi. Anybody familiar with that word? Or know what it is? All right, there's your homework, Jackson, I got you. There's your homework, Nashi, N-A-S-H-I. Look it up, and if you get a chance, try it. It's fun. But you'll hear that sound on this next tune. And we'll close up shop with that standard. Anybody been to the Caribbean before? What is that? Solitary clap. I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna have to write a tune called Never mind. This next tune is given its title from a Caribbean hood, written by a Caribbean cat who played some Caribbean saxophone, along with a wide jazz influence. One of the first tunes that we jazz musicians learn, and again, we pick up tunes and they stay with us for quite a while. This one is Still With Me, and we'll close up shop with a tune by the great Sonny Rollins entitled St. Thomas. St. Thomas. All right, Jackson. Who's going to start this tune off? Take your pick. You have options before you. Joel does not get a vote. Do not take your inspiration. You don't have to decide what Joel decided. He makes a good case. He makes a good case.
You want me to start it?
Yes. Joel Frahm, ladies and gentlemen. Jackson. That's Christian Burgs on the drums. That's Jack Aylor on the bass. That's Alex Murphy on the keys. Put your hands together for one of the brightest stars on saxophone we got in the music, Joel Frahm. My name is Roland Barber. Jackson, it's been a pleasure. We hope to come back and see you again. Jackson. Da 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 da. Thank you very much, Jackson. It's been a pleasure to be able to see you again. Thank you very much. Joel Frahm, Christian Burgs, Jack Aylor, Alex Murphy. My name is Roland Barber. Out of Nashville, Tennessee. If you're ever in Nashville, look us up. And we hope to see you again. If you know people in Memphis, we're in Memphis tomorrow night. We'll be in Birmingham Saturday night. We'll be back in Nashville Sunday night. In case you want to make a little weekend vacation of it, come check us out in Nashville on Sunday. Thank you, Jackson. It's been a treat.